Yeah. Welcome everybody here in the room as well as online to the last seminar of our Human Evolution and the Paleolithic Seminar Series as part of HEAS. And it's a special pleasure to welcome today Alice Leplongeon from Leuven University in Belgium. Alice defended her PhD 10 years ago, if I'm right, and has since then spent a number of postdocs in various nice countries, including Israel, Italy, and of course, Cambridge in the UK, where she conducted her research as part of a Marie Curie fellowship. Yeah, today Alice will talk about not just the corridor towards an alternative narrative for Pleistocene human occupation of northeastern Africa, talking about, I think, some of the work that you also did while you were with us in Cambridge, but also quite a lot of work you've done since then. So a big welcome and please.
Thank you very much, Philip, for the nice introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. And first, it's a real pleasure to be here in Vienna. And I would like to thank very much Tom and Philip for their invitation to participate to this seminar series. And of course, for Maeve for arranging everything. So I would like today to talk about the Paleolithic archaeology of northeastern Africa, which is a region that is often seen in prehistory as a corridor for dispersals, given its geographical location. But I would also like to present some alternative perspectives or views on that region. But first, I'm just going to make the last point. So first, some geographical and environmental background. When we talk about northeastern Africa, we have the Nile in mind. The Nile basin, highlighted in white here, is one of the largest basins on Earth, and the Nile is the longest river on Earth. So it extends from Tanzania and from Lake Victoria to the south up to the Mediterranean Sea. It crosses the hyper-arid Sahara, and as such, it leads, if we may say so, to the only land bridge between Africa and Eurasia. So this is why it is often seen as a corridor for dispersals, a route that hominins would have taken to go out of Africa or back into Africa. And we could indeed argue that most Paleolithic research in that region is framed in a way or another around this corridor narrative. It's true for all periods, but it's particularly true for the MIS5 dispersals or early dispersals of Homo sapiens. And there are usually two different approaches for this archaeology of dispersals, if we can call it like this. One relies on an environmental approach. The Eastern Sahara is indeed a hyper-arid zone, and it's considered as a barrier for hominins to go out of Africa in most of the Pleistocene. So the paleoenvironmental approach to dispersals will look at windows of opportunities for hominins to go out of Africa during more humid periods. And here are two recent papers approaching that issue from paleoenvironmental data. A second approach relies on the archaeological record itself, which for this period consists mostly of stone tools, especially because we are also in the context of desert archaeology with few stratified sites and usually poor organic preservation. So relying on the archaeological record, the idea is to see if we have similarities in lithic technology, which would indicate contact between populations in the frame of dispersals. So in northeastern Africa, there has been one main debate around the Nubian complex, which has been introduced in 1998, which relies on similarities in the archaeological record that can be found within northeastern Africa, but the same characteristics of the Nubian complex have been found elsewhere as well, in Arabia, in Eastern Africa, and in the Levant. And this gave rise to a debate to see whether these similarities could be could indicate contact between population or could arise independently, and if they were the result of independent innovation or convergence. So this is right now a large debate on that, on the prehistory. So I'm going to go back into that, but I started to be interested in these issues shortly after my PhD, when I looked at the back into Africa dispersals that some genetic studies placed at the end of the Pleistocene and suggest the Nile Valley as a possible route. The problem is that comparisons between the Nile Valley and the Levant, systematic comparisons, are still rare and didn't occur in a systematic way. So a few researchers had suggested similarities between the Nile Valley and the Levant based on lithic data that are characterized by the production of bladelets, the use of the microburin technique to produce backed artifacts. So we conducted one of the first systematic comparison of assemblages located in the Nile Valley and in the Levant, but our results showed that these were only superficial similarities and that there are many differences in the preparation of the striking platform, management of convexities, and standardization of the products of the backed tools. So based on the conclusions of our comparisons of the archaeological record, we could not conclude that contacts between these two regions at the end of the Pleistocene. So these results partly supported the hypothesis that the Nile Valley at this time was rather isolated. And these were the starting point of new research perspectives on this region, looking at the region as not just a corridor. And this was developed first as a collaborative work with the organization of a workshop in 2018, which for the first time had also researchers addressing this problem of comparability between the archaeological record of northeastern Africa and the Levant, the Northwest Africa and Eastern Africa, also based on materials, and here it was collections that are stored in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. So some of these discussions were published in 2020 in a book which is called Not Just a Corridor, which I took the title of for this talk. So what I want to do with this talk is to present some thoughts on the northeastern Africa as a corridor for dispersal, or as not just a corridor. And as such, I will divide it in two parts. The first one will look at the history of research in that region and see how the corridor narrative became the dominant one for that region. And in the second part of the talk, it will be a bit more practical. I will present some preliminary results of fieldwork in that area. So first, some historical perspective on this narrative, corridor narrative, starting at the end of the 19th century with the very first research on Egyptian prehistory. And this was the work of Adrien Arcelin in 1867, who was known at the time for his geological work in the Saône Valley in France and his excavations of the Roche de Solutré site, which will become one of the main Upper Paleolithic sites in France. And he decided to use the geological approach that he applied to the Saône Valley to the Nile Valley, and to use a geological approach to demonstrate the existence of a Stone Age in Egypt. So he found some hand axes in Nile deposits that were clearly anterior to the historical sites, and that he used to demonstrate, until proven otherwise, of the existence of a Stone Age in Egypt. And he stays very cautious, and the reason why he stays cautious in his conclusions, it's because at that time, the Egyptological community was very against the idea of a Stone Age in Egypt. They saw it as part of the cultural viability of Egyptian historical, the Egyptian antiquity, in the antiquity, sorry. And they didn't, they rejected that idea. So even after his these first publications, during half a century, there were still debates opposing prehistorians with a geological approach and Egyptologists with a more philological approach. And it's only until many people place the publication of Jacques de Morgan's 1896 research on the origins of Egypt as a milestone in the recognition of the Stone Age in Egypt. Just to a bit of context about how prehistory was seen at that time. And at the end of the 19th century, the classification that was used was the one of Gabriel de Mortier, and who divided the Paleolithic into several phases. And what is also important to consider is that he was seeing the development of man as following a linear progress, so from very simple tools to more complex tools, and also following the role of a similar development. So humans everywhere would have followed the same development phases. What he was also seeing was a gap between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, that with the Neolithic brought by human migrations coming from Anatolia or Caucasus. And I'm mentioning this because when Morgan publishes his first book, then Mortier is pleased with the conclusions because it confirms his model, according to which Stone Age has followed in Egypt the same evolution than in other countries. But Jacques de Morgan, as well as the rest of the prehistorian community, starts to deviate from the model of Mortier, which is a very simple model in terms of progress, linear progress. And he also starts in his later publications to highlight the role of convergence for similarities between the European and the Egyptian record. In terms of also the chronocultural context, Morgan sees a gap between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, but he sees it in Egypt starting at the end of the Mousterian in Egypt. So there is no Upper Paleolithic, according to him, in Egypt. And that would be because of a large environmental cataclysm at the end of the Middle Paleolithic that would have large floods that would have impeded human occupation of this area. Shortly after Morgan's research in Egypt, there has been very few prehistoric research in Egypt focusing on the Paleolithic periods. But there is the work of Edmond Vignard at the beginning of the 20th century, which he is an engineer. He's working for the sugar factories in Egypt, in the Komombo area. And he was an amateur of prehistoric archaeology. He was working with Victor Comon in northern France, so he was trained in lithic technology as well as in the geology geology. And he publishes two papers in 1921 and 1922 with the results of his surveys in the Komombo area. The first paper is about an orignation site that he would have found. So he argues that he found the first evidence for an Upper Paleolithic in Egypt. And he explains the presence of orignation in Egypt as resulting from a migration from Asia of the orignation down to the Nile Valley and up until South Africa. In his second paper, he publishes a new lithic industry, the Sibyllian, which sees a gradual evolution from the Mousterian to the microlithic industries, the microlithic back tool industry. So from Levallois-based technology and gradually arriving to trapezes, microlithic trapezes that would be characteristic of the end of the Pleistocene. And because he sees this gradual development in Egypt, he sees it as the origins of all European microlithic industries in Europe. So I think you see where I want to go now. So we have two very opposed views with Morgan. So they are opposed in a lot of conceptions about the prehistory of Egypt. But we have here one of the first convergence versus migration debate. It's shortly before Morgan dies, so he sees the two papers and he will make a reply in l'Anthropologie. I've chosen the most polite passages of these replies, which illustrate like really the two main poles in this kind of convergence versus migration debates, where Morgan sees that there are only certain forms that can be produced by napping, and that it's natural that the same forms would emerge in different countries without necessarily involving contact. While Vignard replied that to him it's more complicated to see something emerging spontaneously in different places than to see a single source for them. And that if he agrees that forms or typology can be similar, the fact that they are similar in the way they are made makes the difference and can allow to be considered, certain tools to be considered as belonging to the same civilization. So we have really two different views here. Despite Vignard being still convinced of his interpretation, the fact is that his interpretation as the Sibyllian being at the origins of all microlithic industries in Europe never convinced the prehistorian communities. And there is another scenario that emerges with later research, and in particular, research by Gertrude Catton-Thompson and Soliman Hussain. Soliman Hussain, who was going to be the Ministry of Culture for Egypt, but who was one of the first Egyptian prehistorians. And even if they see a gradual tendency at the end of the Middle Paleolithic for the artifacts to become microlithic, they see it as reflecting the cultural isolation of Egypt. So something gradually independently, so gradually locally evolving towards diminutive forms, but that would not be in contact with adjacent regions. Here we are at a period where there is no radiocarbon chronology yet, but based on correlations, they still put that gradual development towards diminutive Middle Paleolithic as contemporaneous with the Upper Paleolithic in Europe and in the Levant. And what is interesting, in my opinion, is that this led to this perception by mostly European researchers that the prehistory in Egypt was delayed compared to Europe and the Levant, and that it doesn't contribute to the main debates at the time, which are the transition from the Middle to the Upper Paleolithic. And that's something important to consider for the next phase of development of prehistory in that area, which is related to the Nubia campaign, which was a major rescue campaign of all archaeological sites that would be flooded by the construction of the Aswan Dam from the 1960 to the 1970 in southern Egypt and northern Sudan. And what is said is that when they were looking for people leading the prehistoric expeditions there that most European scholars were not interested because they thought, or they had this view of the Egyptian prehistory as being delayed, or they even say retarded compared to other regions. So here are a few prehistoric expeditions that took part in this major rescue campaign. And one of the main one is the combined prehistoric expedition that was led by Fred Wendorf. And it's Fred Wendorf who explains why he, in the end, in his autobiography, came to lead that main campaign, while he had not, he was not an Africanist or specialized in African archaeology. He had major experience in rescue archaeology, but was not a specialist of the continent. And what is interesting is that he says that his first action was to go to Europe, that he needed to hire people that knew European Paleolithic typology. So even though they were thinking that the prehistory was isolated from the Levant and the European prehistory, it still was the first choice for researchers who had to work there. And his first stop was in Bordeaux to see François Borde. So we have a direct application of European and French prehistory systematics to the Northeastern African record. And he led a large team spread across several locations in southern Egypt and northern Sudan. So the Nubia campaign led to one of the most important contributions at that time to the chronocultural framework of the Egyptian prehistory. And here an example, so with the Middle Paleolithic, the definition of several industries based more or less on Bordian systematics. And here you can perhaps recognize as well the diagram typical of Borde, and also the emergence of Nubia as a border area where the northward expansion of the Sango and Lupamban people, so the people from Central and Eastern Africa, came in contact with people from the Mousterian tradition, so from the north, where Nubia would be a kind of crossroad between different African traditions and European traditions. Of course, they excavated sites from all periods, and they also built a huge contribution to the chronocultural framework of the late Paleolithic, with and that they used the same typological approach to the grouping of the assemblages, with a working hypothesis that these groupings represent different groups that are closely related social units. So this gave rise, so this is one of the diagrams in the 1968 publication, where they still saw the Egyptian Paleolithic, or the Northeastern African Paleolithic record as relatively local development, what they call the Nilotic adjustment, but with a number of influences, either from Central Africa, some with Northwestern Africa as well. So it's only also with the shift in the taxonomy in the 1990s and 2000, where we have the development of technological approaches based on the chaîne opératoire concept, and all these debates around the definition and interpretation of Levallois technology, that we have new ways of looking at the archaeological record, and in particular, the work of the Belgian Middle Egypt Prehistory Expedition, with the work as well of Philippe Van Peer, who looked at not only the proportion of Levallois, for example, in an assemblage, but more detailed way of characterizing it. However, at the same time, we have a continuation of the work of the combined prehistoric expedition in the Western desert, which continued to apply a modified Bordian system, and also the work in the oasis of the Western desert with the Rarga Archaeological Prehistory Project and the Dala Prehistory Project, where we have also some of the first critics of this import of European ways of analyzing the data while we are in Africa, and that we should use also different systems. So a variety of approach as well to that record. And it's nonetheless one of the main taxonomical unit that stayed is the one that was introduced in 1998 by Philippe Van Peer, which is the Nubian complex. And that took place in the context of the debates around modern human origins and the out of Africa models. We are, for example, 10 years after the publication, the first genetic paper on the single origin of Homo sapiens. So based on similarities found in the archaeological record, they were grouped into a higher entity, which was called the Nubian complex. And as I said at the beginning, which was found in different areas and could indicate dispersals, like contact between population in the context of dispersals. And then we made a loop to some of the first slides of the talk, where we are back to the debate, to the out of Africa dispersals or convergence debate. So this short historical overview shows that we had for the Northeastern African since very early an emphasis on links with the Eurasian prehistory, or a time of absence of links, that timidly there were some suggestions for links with Central or Eastern Africa, but that the fact that European methods and approaches were applied to the archaeology of Northeastern Africa made that there is a lack of comparability of data between the Nile Valley and Northeastern Africa with other African regions. And this is emphasized as well by the fact that in this area we have few stratified and well-dated sites, and there is also, after the 1990s, there were a drop in research intensity in the Paleolithic, for the Paleolithic in these regions, compared to, for example, Northwestern Africa, where a lot more recent research led to more dated sites. So this is changing because there are some work in Sudan that contributes to this issue. So what I would like to invite you today is now not to see the Nile Valley as a south-north axis, but also to look at the region on a different axis, which is east-west, and in a more local perspective to that region. Where we have the Nile, we have in a restricted geographical space, very contrasted environments with the Nile Valley and its luxurious vegetation, and right after the hyper-arid desert. So to try to see what we can say about human-environment interactions within Northeastern Africa. And when we look at this perspective, here it's a work in progress, so there are many sites missing, but you can still see that until recently, most of the research has focused on the Nile Valley, as well as in oasis in the desert, but that we have large areas of the region that are unexplored. And for the Paleolithic archaeology. So what I would like to shortly present today are preliminary results of two recent fieldwork in Sudan and in Egypt of sites located a few dozens of kilometers east of the Nile Valley, so which made them interesting to study in interactions between the Nile Valley and adjacent deserts. So starting with the Shaqadud Archaeological Project, which is directed by Ladislav Varadzin, that is, so Shaqadud is located in central Sudan. It's about 40 kilometers southeast of the Nile. You can see here, Jebel Shaqadud. So the project focuses on the Holocene history of the site, and it's actually we are so 40 kilometers east of the Nile, and this is a site that was also partly excavated by the Combined Prehistoric Expedition in the 80s, and that led one of the most complete Holocene sequence in the Sahel, with indications that there were subsistence economies that were really different from the Nile, and few contacts between the Nile and this region. The Shaqadud Archaeological Project is in place since 2018 and focused on this Holocene archaeological sequence, and could show that at Shaqadud we have the earliest reoccupation of desertic areas in the Holocene after the very arid phase at the end of the Pleistocene. So it's in relation to springs that would have been active in this Jebel very early in the Holocene, that also ask the question of where was the refugium from where these populations would have come from after the conditions were more humid. So there was no Paleolithic archaeology mentioned in the first publications, but there were hints that Paleolithic artifacts were present in the most recent investigations of the site, and that's why I joined the site earlier this year in February. The fieldwork in this site is quite challenging, and one reason for that is that there are a lot of geofacts. So, lithics that look like artifacts but are not. And it's also an area that was really intensively occupied during the Holocene, including sandstone exploitation. We are in the Nubia sandstone formation. And so here you have, for example, an example of geofacts. When you look, so the raw material is peeling off in certain ways, and that might look like having a platform with a bulb of percussion. And then we can imagine that with the time passes with patina, then that we need to be careful into identifying artifacts. And here it's an example of the Holocene activity of the sandstone that was exploited during the Holocene. So this was a little bit challenging first, and until I surveyed this part of Jebel Shaqadud, which was a different landscape with a large canyon here. And that I was very cautious in identifying geofacts and artifacts, but this one I couldn't have any doubt, and that's how we started to see some Paleolithic archaeology with this large preferential core that was lying on that surface. There were a few artifacts around that core, but it was not possible to pinpoint a source for these artifacts. It lies in secondary position. A second area where we found Stone Age finds were at the top of the canyon. So the canyon is here, where we found these artifacts lying on the surface and on that hill. So here we can see some examples of artifacts from that area, where we have cores as well as large flakes, some with thick faceted platforms and tools. So the material is very eroded, very abraded, and again, being very specific about collecting the artifacts that only present very clear features of being napped. And here with tools with denticulate edges, denticulated retouch. On top of that heel, there is a playa with on the edge, there were also artifacts on the surface that present similar characteristics with large Levallois flakes, discoid cores, as well as large tools with denticulate retouch. So this would place, so Shaqadud is here, so it would place this Paleolithic occupation at Shaqadud at the end of the Acheulean or beginning of Middle Stone Age, given the characteristics of the assemblages, and cautiously attributing this without having any date. But what is interesting is that there has been other research in other parts of Sudan, and in particular in that area, the Edar area, where we have a lot more data on this Acheulean and early Middle Stone Age with dated sites. So future investigations at Shaqadud will look at the assemblage in its wider context with this data coming from other sites. Yes, so this is also a question would be like how human occupation was possible in that area. Can we correlate this occupation with Pleistocene humid periods leading to the spring activity? So it's only the beginning of the work. And here I would like to mention the whole team of the Shaqadud Archaeological project with special thoughts for our Sudanese colleagues that are currently living a very difficult situation. The second project I wanted to tell you about is the Wadi Abu Subeir project, which is a Franco-Egyptian project led by Genola Graf, and which is ongoing since 2013. Its main focus was on the rock art of the Wadi, which is particularly rich, including for the predynastic engravings, and there will be a monograph out in the few months on this specific type of archaeology in the Wadi. Paleolithic archaeology in the Wadi Abu Subeir was known before the project, in particular for, so the Wadi Abu Subeir is here, it's in front of the Wadi Kubaniya, which is known for its many occupations of the late Paleolithic. And the Wadi Abu Subeir is also known for occurrences of late Paleolithic rock art. There was one Middle Paleolithic that was described at the entrance of the Wadi. And as you can see, the late Paleolithic rock art is stopping a few kilometers east of the Nile Valley. The Wadi Abu Subeir contains iron ore formation. So it's a Nubia sandstone formations with iron ore, which led to modern exploitation that are very intensive, especially the closer to the Nile we get, and that of course makes it important to understand that the heritage, all the archaeological sites are in danger, and in particular the rock art occurrences that are in the Wadi. Most of the Paleolithic occupation are on top of the plateaus. Here you have a map of the eastern concession of the Wadi Abu Subeir, where you have the main Stone Age locations that have been mapped during the 2022 field season. And as you can see, they are concentrated on the Leaf Plateau that we call the Leaf Plateau, given its shape. We identified several phases of occupation during the Paleolithic, and in different forms. And here, for example, is an isolated cleaver of the earlier, so related to earlier Stone Age occupation, or like this hand axe that was found in a completely deflated zone with no identifiable artifacts around it. There are also artifacts scattered in also completely eroded landscapes with artifacts on the surface that can be attributed to either the earlier Stone Age or the Middle Stone Age. But some of the most zones with the most potentials are the workshops. And in particular, here is an example of a Middle Stone Age workshop. So you have here the sandstone outcrop, and where here is like a human modified landscape almost, because it's the sandstone layers that have been exploited. And you have here a photo of the stone being extracted. That's also what it looks like. So it's specific formations of sandstone that are particularly suitable for knapping. They have those very bright colors like red and yellow, and they led to a very intensive accumulation of artifacts. So every stone that you have on that photo is an artifact, with potentially some that are buried, so it will be investigated in the future for with excavations. So here we have what does the material look like? So it's mostly Middle Stone Age assemblages with Levallois and discoid cores, as well as blade cores of relatively reduced size and small bifacial points. For the workshop, we also have some possibly earlier Stone Age workshops. So it's a bit further on the plateau where we have different sandstone outcrop with more coarser raw material that was also exploited probably during the earlier Stone Age, with large flakes and large cores directly on the site. Here is another example of some artifact accumulation, which have this very dark patina that is very characteristic. So at the end of the 2022 field season, we have numerous evidence for human occupation during the earlier and Middle Stone Age in this part of the Wadi Abu Subeir. There is no evidence for late Paleolithic occupation, which suggests that this part was too away from the Nile Valley to have been inhabited. That's a working hypothesis. Most of the occupation that we see is linked to raw material procurement, which is also interesting to consider in terms of links between the Nile Valley and the desert. Was the desert occupation exclusively linked to raw material procurement, or were there also some living areas there? We will need to investigate that by systematic surveys. And also one assumption that is often made is that these occupations in the desert are usually correlated with humid periods, but it's an assumption that's not demonstrated. So we're also going to investigate this further, especially since it's only 15 to 25 kilometers away from the Nile Valley. Is it do these occupations systematically have to be correlated with human periods, or were they just like temporary incursions into the desert from the Nile Valley? So I thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.